This is Gareth Aden, and I'm here this afternoon with one of Nashville's best known and leading trial attorneys, a gentleman who has been a previous United States District Attorney and a leader in the bar, Ed Yarbrough. Ed, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Gareth.
To begin our oral history, if you don't mind, give me your full name and the date and place of birth.
My name is Edward Meacham, M-E-A-C-H-A-M, Yarbrough. I was born on December 17th, 1943.
And was that here in Nashville?
Here in Nashville at the old St. Thomas, 20th and Church.
I remember it well. And tell us a little bit about your childhood and family growing up.
Well, after I was born, went home to 902 Wilson Boulevard, and I have to sort of step outside of the story a little bit and tell you what had happened the month before, because it's kind of part of my family history. My father had a son by a previous marriage whose name was Charlie, and he was a student at Duncan School, and on the afternoon of November 17, a month before I was born, he was coming home on the city bus and got off at the corner of West End and Wilson Boulevard. And being 13 and very energetic, he ran around the front of the bus to cross the street, not knowing that the City Express bus was in the other lane. And he was hit and killed. Ironically, the witness who was mentioned in the paper or newspaper article about that incident was Assistant District Attorney Ned Lentz, who later became a chancellor here, and two sons, and you know well. Of course, I'm not born at that point, and I'm too young to understand what's going on the first few years, but my parents moved out of that house, I think to escape the memories, and moved across the street. So the house that I remember first is 903 Wilson. And I don't really recall any particular unpleasantness, but I know that my parents were grieving over that, and as a result, they separated when I was 5 and divorced when I was 7. So I only went 1 year at Woodmont School, which was just 2 doors down, and then I went to live with my grandparents over on 12th at Carruthers, and was able to go to the Stoke School from there for 3 years. And then my grandfather bought a duplex out on Kimbark Drive, a little street out in Green Hills that had all duplexes up and down the street. And they let my mother, my sister, and I live in the upstairs apartment, 2-room apartment. And that's really where I grew up.
Right. What was your mother's name?
Miriam Mefford Yarbrough.
And the grandparents that you lived with and played a part in bringing you up?
That would be Nathan Frederick Mefford, and he was from Kentucky and had worked for the L&N Railroad.
That's a good place to work.
As a result, even though it was, during the Depression, that railroad job saw him through it. So my grandparents really were not that profoundly affected by the Depression. My grandmother was Mary Peeny Meacham of the Leapers Fort Meacham family, my middle name. And they were very good people. And my grandmother especially was sort of my parent most of the time, because when my mother had to go to work, of course, and so my grandmother is the one that was the primary disciplinarian at the house.
Where did your mom work?
She worked at the Insurance Company of North America down in the old American Trust building. And she worked for a very fine man named Beth Shares. Okay. I believe his name was William Beth Shares. And he was the head of that. And later on, Mr. Benz, Billy Benz, I believe, or one of the Benz boys. Anyway, they were very good to her, and I got to know some of those folks.
You mentioned you had an older sister?
Yes, my sister Madge, or Margaret, is 2 years older, 2.5, and she really didn't remember Charlie, but obviously she'd been alive when Charlie was, and she went to Vanderbilt, but we used to joke that she got the MRS degree from Vanderbilt. She married an engineer over there and then dropped out, and she's still living in this area. She's in Goodlettsville.
Now, you finished, I think, school at, was it Burton Hills?
Well, yes, talking about elementary school?
Yes.
Yes.
Elementary.
Once we moved out to the Green Hills area, I went to Burton for 4 years,
Okay.
and then to Hillsborough High School.
During this period when you were growing up, and I guess while you were still in elementary school, did you hold a job?
Yes, one afternoon when I was in the 8th grade, I came home, and sitting in the living room with my mother was a gentleman named Howard R. Clark, who was the route manager for the Tennessean and Banner, working for the Newspaper Printing Corporation that used to print and distribute both newspapers, morning and evening newspaper in Nashville for many years. And I met Mr. Clark and discovered that he was there to ask me if I wanted to be a route carrier on Warfield, Kimbark, and Yarbrough. And my memory of it is that I did not know that was going to occur until it was happening. My mother, who was a saint and is totally responsible for anything that I've ever amounted to, did have a little bit of a control streak in her, and when she thought I needed to do something, she just kind of set it up, and then I was expected to go along. And thank goodness I did, because I think that was one of the greatest things that I ever did, was carry that paper route. I had to get up at 4:30 in the morning, 7 days a week for 3 years, and come home from school every afternoon at 3 and deliver the Banner. So it was a full-time obligation for a young person, but very helpful in terms of teaching discipline and perseverance and whatever else it took to get that done.
I did the same thing and agree with you. I think there were some well-known lawyers who also were paper boys in your
Yes, yeah, I have sort of a special bond with Doug Fisher and Bob Ballou, both of whom carried papers. And I think both of them actually started younger than I did, and I know Bob made a career out of it because he represented the papers for many years. And Doug used to tell me that he delivered the paper to the courthouse in 1937 when it was constructed. So, yeah, they're proof positive that if you deliver papers when you're young, you can grow up to be a fairly decent lawyer.
How about high school? Tell us where you went.
Went to Hillsborough, just a few blocks away, and
How did it go?
it was okay. I didn't really like school, but I did okay most of the time. I was especially good at math for some reason. And so I did well there, and the history and the English, I just kind of rocked along best I could. And something happened when I was about 15 that kind of interfered with that I expect you're going to ask me about.
That's honestly next on the list. How about hobbies?
Yeah, back then, Hillsborough had high school fraternities and sororities, and they had a rush period. And one of my neighbors, a fellow named John Michelle, who was in my class and now lives in Chicago, came to me one afternoon because I had a motor scooter. Because I was making money, I was able to purchase a few things that my buddies didn't have. And he said, I've gone to a cave on one of these rush parties, and if you'll give me a ride on your motor scooter, I'll show you where it is. And so I had read the Hardy Boy books, and I think you shared with me privately that you might have been guilty of the same thing. And most of those stories had tunnels and caves as a part of them, so the idea of going underground was just very interesting to me. And so I said, let's go. And we got flashlights and went out there. It was Vaughn's Gap Cave on Highway 100 near Warner Park. And it was only a two-room thing, but it's big enough to walk in. It's bigger than this room by good measure. And I was just fascinated with it from the very first time. And there were bats in there. And I'd never been afraid of animals of any kind for some reason. So I just collected 5 or 6 of them, put them in a paper sack, and brought them home, let them go in the house. And they flew around for a few minutes, not in the house, but upstairs in our little area. They flew around for a few minutes, and then they attached themselves to the inside of the curtains. And I figured, you know, I'm okay now because they're not going to see them. Well, I wasn't smart enough to realize that when it got dark, the bats were automatically going to start looking for insects and a way out. So my sister just went crazy. My mother thought it was funny, but my sister couldn't tolerate it, so she made me get the bats out of the house.
Your mother must have been a saint. I think I would have probably been shot. What did that trip, it obviously led to a lot more caving.
Yes, that trip was the start of something that really has stayed with me all these years, although serious caving is a young man's game. My age, you don't go on expeditions like I used to, but and I know we're not here to talk about caves, but I went to caves in Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, California, Mexico, Honduras, and during my peak period, I would go down pits over 1,000 feet deep on a single rope. And we found some pits and some caves that had never been entered before. I've probably been the first person down anywhere from 50 to 100 natural limestone shafts that had caves at the bottom of them. And it's a very exciting sport. You've got to know what you're doing. I had good friends that helped me learn the right technique, but it was a real adventure. And that was something that just infected my heart, so to speak, and I couldn't stop thinking about it.
Well, we'll return to caving in a little while, but I think it did affect your schooling.
It sure did. My senior year at Hillsborough, I had applied to Georgia Tech and Vanderbilt and been accepted by both, somewhat to my surprise because my grades weren't that good, but my math scores were really high, and so I think that's what helped. But that was also the year that I decided I wanted to be a tour guide at Cumberland Caverns down in McMinnville. And so I started skipping class and doing things that I shouldn't have been doing. And as a result of all that foolishness, I failed to graduate from Hillsborough on time, and which was, of course, profoundly disappointing to my mother, which I greatly regret now, realizing what it was probably like. But at the time, all I thought was, I'm doing what I want to do. I'm going to go down to the cave and spend the rest of my life there, or whatever I thought. I don't know. I wasn't thinking too well. But I couldn't go to college because I didn't have a high school diploma.
What ultimately happened? Did you, I realized that for a while you were basically the main guide at Cumberland?
Well, there were 2 of us, a fellow from Cookeville named David Smith, and then myself. And we were working for Roy Davis, living in a farmhouse and working, you know,
sure,
24 hours a day almost. Yeah, I came back, and my mother again stepped in and got me admitted to the Peabody Demonstration School, which we call University School now. And so I went there with another famous Nashvilleian, by the way, a fellow named Will Cheek, was my colleague as a 5-year man at Peabody. I've joked with him about that over the years, and his son, who's also a lawyer. But I almost didn't make it there. I don't know what happened. I just didn't care about school that much. And again, my mom, realizing that someday I would repent of all that, somehow applied for me to Southwestern at Memphis, which we now call Rhodes. And they took me. And I'm not sure why with that record, but I think that it was those scores on the math tests that got me in those places.
Yeah. This is in the fall of '62?
Fall of '62, yes, sir.
Okay.
And unlike today, I'd never heard of that place. I'd never been to it. The first time I saw Southwestern in Memphis is the day my mother dropped me off on the corner at Tutwiler and Evergreen and pointed to a building that we thought was the dorm. And I took my bag and walked off, and she drove away. And
how did you like it?
Well, I loved it. I loved it, actually, at least for a year or two. The professors were brilliant. Dr. Amaker had been an interpreter at the Versailles Peace Conference. Dr. Ferris, the English teacher, was just a magnificent lecturer. Dr. Hemphill in the history department mentored me, cared about me. That was the first time in a long time anybody had done that, in my view, and so it kind of made an impression on me.
Were you centering on math?
I was a math major, and what happened was the second semester of my sophomore year, the math started getting uninteresting to me, and because I'd always liked trigonometry and geometry and things that, in my view, made sense. And now that we're talking about calculus and quantum physics and all this stuff, and it didn't make sense to me anymore, and I really just turned it off. And so when I came back the following year, I started goofing off again, and decided that maybe caving wasn't so bad after all. And so I got a job as a electrician's assistant working for Roy Davis, the fellow at Cumberland Caverns, who at that time was doing a lighting job for the Lost Sea, a commercial cave operation over in Sweetwater, Tennessee, which is still operating today.
Were they just building Lost Sea, or were they enhancing it?
No, they were building it. It had been Craighead Caverns, and rather difficult to get into, but they drilled a tunnel into the side of the hill and built a ticket office at the entrance to that tunnel so that you could walk right in on level ground to the good part of the cave. And then we did the trails and the lighting, obviously had help. And then the tour ended at the underground lake, which they still advertise as the largest underground lake in North America.
How long did you stay away from college?
I stayed there the whole spring of 1965, and then that summer I decided I better get on back to college.
Yeah. You returned, in other words, to Southwestern.
I did, yes. They took me back, and even though I had Fs or incompletes on all my subjects the previous semester, the fall of '64, I guess it was.
Was it hard for your mom to pay tuition, or had you gotten some help?
It was hard, and I'm frankly not sure how she was doing it. But something else very fortunate happened, because when I went back, I got in a room with a fellow named John Booth Faris, who is a very successful trial lawyer today down in Mississippi. And he and I were baseball players. We were on the baseball team together. And after we got to know each other a little bit, he confided in me that he had a summer job that was pretty remarkable. This is 1966 by now. And he said, why don't you come on up to Pennsylvania with me and sell real estate? And there was a company in Memphis called American Realty Service Corporation that would go up into Pennsylvania and Ohio and places like that and buy up farmland at cheap prices, and then build a lake and subdivide it into lots. And the lots were on the lake, of course, once they filled the lake. And sell them at $10,000 a piece. And they had college kids like us just meeting the customer. They'd run big ads in the paper in Cleveland and Pittsburgh, and the customer would drive out on a Sunday afternoon, and we'd put them in our car and drive them around and give them the hard sell, and glory be, a lot of them made a purchase, and we got a 10% commission. So I made almost, I think it was $7,000 in the summer of 1966, which paid my way to school.
Man. Once you had gone back in the fall of '65 to Southwestern, what sort of course of study did you take? You had apparently fallen out with math.
Yeah, a little bit of a paradigm change there. I'm really not sure I want to tell this, but you know it, so I know you're going to ask me. I was sitting in a drive-in out in Sweetwater that summer, and with a young lady that I was trying to impress. I've always been trying to do that. Fortunately, my wife now is still impressed with me, but I don't know how that happened. But anyway, we were sitting there talking, and she knows I'm going back to school, and she says, well, what are you going to major in? And I hadn't thought about it. And so, but I didn't want to tell her that. So I said, political science. That's the hard major at Southwestern. So I'm going to switch to political science. And she followed that up. She might have been a lawyer herself, I don't know. She said, well, what are you going to do with that? And I hadn't thought about that either, and I just said law school. And that sounded really good. I think her father was a doctor, so, you know, I just hate admitting how superficial I was back then, but that's just the way it was.
Did you do any extracurricular things at Southwestern?
I did. When I went back and got serious about class, I also decided that I might want to do some extracurricular stuff. And I had noticed that the newspaper at the school was kind of second-rate. There was a little tabloid, 4 pages. And it came out regularly, and it was decent enough, but it just didn't have any real excitement to it. And I had been the editor of the newsletter for the local cave club for a number of years before that. So I knew a little something about putting together a paper. So I went over there and took a few assignments on the student paper. And then when spring came, when they were deciding who the editor would be for the following year, I applied to be editor, which was a little unusual because there was an assistant editor who kind of expected that he would move up into that slot, and then there was one other columnist, I think, who had applied for it. And somehow or another, though, I went over to the publication board and convinced them that I was the man. So that senior year, I was editor of the college newspaper. And I had somehow noticed the Louisville Courier-Journal. And it was a very fine newspaper in those days, and I decided to copy their format. In fact, I sent a letter to the publisher of that paper years later, well, not years later, but months later, because we won an award for layout from the student rating services. And I felt a little guilty about that, so I sent him a letter and a copy of some of our papers and confessed that I had copied his layout and gotten an award for it, and he was thrilled. He sent me a letter back, I still have that somewhere, from the publisher of the Louisville Courier-Journal complimenting me on stealing his format.
You know, that's amazing because I had worked for the newspaper in college too, and I got to watch, and this was the last years you could do this, I got to watch a man set type in lead.
Yes, we had that too, linotype. Yeah, go downtown at 11 o'clock, stay till 2, and watch him put it all together. He'd run the galley proof, and we'd sit there and read it and tell him what was wrong. He'd fix it. And then we'd go back to the school and stop off at the Tottle House and eat at 4 in the morning. And by noon that day, the paper was there to be handed out.
Did this work in journalism have anything that related to your decision to go to law school or your ability?
It did, kind of in a sideways sort of way. I went to law school thinking that I would get a law degree and be a journalist, because that's what I really enjoyed about that job at college. And then, as we'll probably learn in a minute, I discovered something else that was even more exciting. So.
Tell me about applying to law school and what decisions you made.
I had 2 buddies at Rhodes, now called Rhodes. Mike Whitaker, who'd been president of the Honor Council, and Don Hollingsworth, who was student government president, and both of them said they were going to try to go to Vanderbilt to law school. And of course, Vanderbilt would be home for me, and so that was a natural. And I said, well, I believe I'll just apply, and maybe we all 3 go together.
Sure.
And lo and behold, that's what happened. Now, they had the grades, I didn't. But the president of the school, a fellow named Alexander, who's now president, or was president of Pomona College out in California, I think was so thankful with the fact that the newspaper was upgraded and had won some awards, and he had only been president of the college for a year and a half at that point. And it was a kind of a feather in his cap too. So he wrote me a letter to Vanderbilt Law School that could peel chrome off a bumper. I mean, it was a very fine, and I think that's what did it, frankly. I hooked up with him years later and thanked him again for that, and he was kind enough to respond.
So you would be entering Vanderbilt Law School in the fall of '66?
67.
67, okay. What was it like? What did you like or dislike?
For the first time in my life, Gareth, I really liked school. They were teaching not just the subject matter, they were teaching about how to think, how to analyze things. And it immediately became interesting to me. And I don't know if that's because of the background in math or just kind of, having a quirky brain or whatever it was, but I enjoyed that first semester of law school more than any other school I'd ever attended.
As it turned out, I guess you went to school with people that we know here in the Bar Association.
Yes. My later partner, John Wagster, was in that class. Most of the people that I remember actually are the ones that I finished with because I didn't finish on time like everything else. But yeah, John Wagster was in there, and Sam Bartholomew came along a little bit later. John Rowe,
yes,
was in that starting class.
You mentioned that you didn't finish with them. What happened?
Yes. Well, I went for first year, 67, 68. And then, of course, we all know, because right now we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of all these events. But in 1968, this country was just in a turmoil. We'd had the Tet Offensive in January of 68. We had the Pueblo crisis where the Koreans stole our ship, still haven't given it back. The death of Martin Luther King in Memphis on April 4th, the assassination of Robert Kennedy in California in June. And the Congress just flipped out, and they decided to just do away with graduate school deferments, just in toto. So all the people in graduate school and law school, not medical, because they wanted doctors, but graduate school, law school, they just lost their deferments overnight. And I remember Dean Wade at the law school called us, just our class, into a big lecture hall and said very ominously, gentlemen, and it was almost all gentlemen at that time, next year at this time, half of you will be gone. And of course, there was a gasp in the room, and he didn't mean we would be dead, but that we would be drafted in somewhere else, not
right.
in school. And there was a rush by many to get into reserve units and stuff like that, but I didn't have any connections like that, and I wasn't really sure I wanted to do that. But I got drafted in the fall of 68, and the bad part was that they said, you've got to report in November, and that would have meant forfeiting of my credits for that semester. So I went over to the Baker Building, 21st and West End, and to the recruiter and said, what can we do? And he said, well, if you'll sign up for OCS, I'll let you report in January, Officer Candidate School. So I said, sign me up. I figured two things. One, I was going to get my semester credits because I was going to be allowed to finish. And number two, they're going to have to pay a little more for my services, even though it extended the time a little bit. And so all that sounded like a good deal, so I took it.
Tell us about your service.
Looking back on it, I really value that experience. At the time, I think I felt I was being mistreated a little bit. Now, I was in favor of the Vietnam War at that time. I had even editorialized at the college on the subject of Vietnam and felt like in order to stop communism in Southeast Asia, that was a necessary war.
Right.
I changed my view of it once I saw it from the inside, but yeah. At that time I was a pretty patriotic guy, so I didn't mind serving. And when I got drafted, when I got inducted, I got on a bus over here at 6th and Union. They used to have you come to the Security Federal Building. And we got on a bus, went out to the airport, got on the plane, flew to Philadelphia, got on another bus, went to Fort Dix, New Jersey in January of 1969. And it just seemed like it snowed every day. I mean, it was cold. But I did training there. Then I went to Missouri for AIT training. And then I went to Fort Benning, Georgia for the summer of 1969 for infantry OCS.
And how long were you there in Georgia?
That was another 6 months. The total training was 10 months to get a commission in the infantry. And had another lucky break when I was at Benning. Every now and then, the colonel from the old guard at Arlington Cemetery would come down to Benning and watch the troops, marching around. And back then, that was the height of the war. That place was packed. But Colonel Leland was his name. And one afternoon, TAC officer, the officer in charge of our unit, called me over and said, they've asked if you wanted to go to the old guard. 2 or 3 of us had been chosen out of that. I didn't know I was such a great marcher. Nobody ever told me that, but must have been. And
what's the old guard?
The old guard is the 3rd Infantry, which is the oldest active unit in the United States Army that has the sole mission of guarding the President, the White House, and doing the ceremonies at the Arlington National Cemetery, including guarding the Tomb of the Unknowns. And when I heard that was the offer, see, I wanted to go to jump school because the jump towers were right across the street from our barracks, and being a caver and a crazy guy to start with, I thought jumping out of an airplane sounded like a great idea. But when he said I could go to the old guard, I realized that was a bigger deal.
Real opportunity.
And so, and the other thing, the collateral thing that I didn't even know about until later, was that was a 1-year commitment, meaning that I would not go to Vietnam as quickly as a lot of my classmates did. And that was good because 2 things were happening. One, I was getting a little more training and seasoning as an officer, and the war was starting to wind down at the end of '69. And by '70, the Vietnamization program had begun. And even though it was still a war and it was still hot, it wasn't as bad as '68. And that was a benefit to me when I finally got there. Even though I was in combat the whole time, I was in the field the whole time. It was not the type of combat that you think about, like Hue and Pleiku and all the places that you saw on television in '67 and '68.
Right. Was this roughly, I guess, a year that you spent? Was it spent in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, I lived just within view of the Pentagon, actually, in Arlington, and was able to drive over to the base, Fort Myer, Virginia. And I was not in the honor guard, so and as an officer, officers don't guard the tomb. Enlisted men guard the tomb. The only time I dealt with the tomb guards was at night. When I was a battalion officer, I would have a key to the cemetery gate and go over there and inspect the guards and be sure they were watching the tomb even at night. And that's a STRAC unit. They would challenge me before I got out of the parking lot. And if I didn't know the password, I wouldn't come in another step. But of course I did, and so I'd go over there and hang out with them, go down to the barracks, and it was quite a treat.
Did I hear you say you also had some White House duty?
Did. The weekend after the Kent State shootings, where the students were shot by the National Guard at Kent State University, there was a huge demonstration on the mall downtown Washington. And President Nixon wanted to make a show of not leaving the White House for Camp David that weekend, but he wanted protection. So they put city buses bumper to bumper all the way around the White House and the Executive Office building, and they had us, about 2 companies, in full battle gear, live ammunition, bivouacked in the Executive Office building for the entire weekend. On Saturday morning of that weekend, I'm up there with my platoon. I was a platoon leader. And I looked down the hall and I saw one man and a dog, a big dog with red floppy hair. I later learned that was King Timahoe or something, the dog that Nixon owned. And there's Richard Nixon with no Secret Service, no protection of any kind, walking down the hall, mixing it up with the troops. And I just thought, how ironic is this? And I shook his hand, and we talked there. I don't remember anything about the conversation. I just was marveling at the fact that here we are, half of my platoon, the enlisted men, had been drafted out of graduate school. And they were just as anti-war as the people on the other side of the barricade. But because they had shaved heads, green uniforms, they were there in the presence of the president with live ammunition and grenades on their belt.
There is an irony.
I've told that story to the Secret Service in Washington later on when I was at the Justice Department, and they couldn't believe it. This is spring of 1970.
Yep. Now, the old guard duty ended after a year, is that right?
That's right, and got my orders to go to Vietnam.
Do you want to talk about that?
I'm happy to talk about it. It was I was not excited about that. I was going to do my duty, but if you'd said, you know, here's an option to not do it, I'd have taken that, I'm sure. But that was not available, and so I went and was assigned to Vietnamese regional forces in the Mekong Delta. We were embedded with them. There were usually 3 or 4 Americans, a captain, a lieutenant, and 2 enlisted men, usually senior sergeants, E6 or E7 sergeant. And we would help them call in airstrikes, help them with artillery, go on air mobile operations, sampan operations, and some ambush. But most of that area down there was so wet that you couldn't walk a half a mile in any direction. And so most of our operations were either in helicopters or on boats of some kind. And I saw combat. I got a combat infantry badge and a Bronze Star during that service. And I'm proud of that now. But at the time, frankly, I was thinking to myself, this is a colossal waste. And I can tell you the day I really made up my mind about that. We had captured a North Vietnamese soldier in one of our operations with a blue shirt. That was unusual because the Viet Cong always dressed in black. This guy had a blue shirt, which was the official color of the North Vietnamese Army. And a lot of people didn't realize that North Vietnamese Army had a presence in the Delta, but they were hiding out in these mangrove forests. And a lot of those places is where we dropped the Agent Orange. But we'd captured this fellow, and they had taken him back to the district headquarters for questioning. In fact, I've got a picture. I wasn't supposed to take it probably, but I've got a picture at home of this fellow in a tiger cage. A tiger cage is a cube about 3 by 3 by 3 made of barbed wire. And so about a week later, I asked my Trung Huy, my counterpart. Trung Huy is the Vietnamese word for lieutenant. I said, what happened to that prisoner that we had? He said, oh, you didn't hear? I said, no. Village chief sold him back to the Viet Cong. After I realized what he'd said, I went back to my little hooch, which I guess was in a bunker at that time. Got out my short timer calendar and started marking off the days. All I wanted was out.
How long were you there, Ed?
I was there about 7.5, 8 months, I think.
Yeah.
I got an early out. They were winding down, and so I got an early out to come back to school. And as a result, only had about 3 days to get back to Nashville and get back in school at Vanderbilt.
Would this be the fall of 1971?
That's correct.
Well, what was it like? You were back in law school, but not with the people you'd started with.
That's right. Bill Coke, Walter Kurtz, people like that were in the class. Tom White, Gordon James, and it was great. Being back was that's big stuff. You know, when you land at Oakland, and it's not like World War II now, but it's close, because when you land and you realize you're back in the United States of America after being in harm's way for 7 or 8 months, it's a big deal, even for somebody like me who didn't seem to care about physical comfort, because I'd been a caver all that time and didn't mind hard times.
But your life was at risk.
Yeah, it was dangerous.
One question that comes to mind, I guess 2 questions, and I'll ask them both at once, although I'm trained not to do that. One, how did you do at school? And number 2, did you have any problems with money?
I did fairly well. I wasn't top of the class or anything, but as I say, it really clicked with me. So I did study, and I did make decent grades. And I think that had something to do with the part-time job that I got, and I think that's probably where we're going now.
Tell us about that.
Before I left, actually, in the fall of '68, I realized that I didn't have enough money to finish school, even though I'd had those 2 great summers with John Faris, and made several $1,000s both summers, enough to keep me going. But I was in a study group with a fellow named Richard Croteau, who was a very smart law student and now lives in Ooltewah, Tennessee. And Richard had a part-time job at the DA's office. And by the way, the full story on this is in the Shriver years. Give a little plug for me and Hal Hardin and one of these other oral histories on the Shriver years, where we tell this story about how Richard Croteau got scared one afternoon on something that Tom Shriver asked him to do with Hal Hardin and Sterling Gray. And he went home that night and told his wife about it. His wife said, you're not going back. And so he came to the study group. He didn't tell us about that part. I learned that years later. But he came back and said he wanted to be #1 in the class, which he did, by the way, and that he was going to study all the time. And so as a result, he had quit that job. And if anybody wanted to apply for that job, they better get on down there. And so I was down there the next day.
How about that?
And I met Tom Shriver, and I think Carl Warden, the criminal law professor, had given me a good recommendation. And I got that job. It was a 20-hour-a-week job downtown in the courthouse with Tom Shriver in the DA's office. I met Hal Hardin. I met Randall Wyatt. John Hollins was a part-time assistant at that time and trying all the big cases.
Wow.
So that was the beginning of a change of career.
Yeah, I realize this is extremely important in your career. Now, so you had actually started before you went to Vietnam and then came
That's right.
back
Yeah.
and worked there again.
And, you know, Shriver, I'm sure you know him, knew him. He was just a prince of a guy, and loyal, you know, honest, unbelievable. And he had told me if I came back, I think he may have said if I came back, don't know, but that the job would be there.
Yeah.
And so I took him at his word, and I don't think I communicated with him much while I was in the Army. But when I got back, I called him up, and General Shriver, I'm back. Got all my fingers and toes. Can I come to work next week? He said, sure. And I found out a long time later that he had already filled the job. But he had to call that fellow up and say, Yarbrough's back. Sorry.
He did keep his word.
And yeah, he's a man of his word. Tom White was one of the other assistants. By that time, they had 4.
You know, it might be interesting for people to know, what was this job that you did while you were a law student?
Yes, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, LEAA, had been created under Johnson, President Johnson. And some people would say it was a little bit of a boondoggle, but obviously I was happy about it. And it was a way to get law students into the prosecutor's offices to do the menial tasks and help them out, you know, with their mission. And right about that same time, the law schools, the state bar examiners, decided that it would be okay for people in that position who were already in their 3rd year to go to court. And so as a result, I actually tried cases in General Sessions Court with Tommy Thompson and some of the other assistants while I was still in school. In fact, my son, Charles, is doing that right now over here in Glenn Funk's office. He's 3rd year at Belmont.
And Tommy Thompson ended up being a district attorney here in Tennessee.
Tommy was an assistant at that time and is now, I think, the longest serving DA in the history of Tennessee.
Wow. How did you do in school after you came back?
I did well enough. They gave me a half tuition scholarship after the 1st year, and that was a big help. And then, of course, when I got back from the Army, I had the GI Bill, so I had 3 sources of income. I had the half tuition scholarship, I had the 20-hour-a-week job, and then the GI Bill. And with the 3 of those, I was able to finish.
Right. Any professors that we haven't talked about that you were impressed with and want to remember?
Carl Warden certainly stands out. I would say that, oh, gee, I hate to mention somebody and leave them out, but Hartman always appealed to me because he was so cynical, but he clearly cared for the law students. But he had this crusty exterior that he wanted to use. I liked him. I liked Troutman, Covington, people like that. They were, I would say they were old school. They were not trying to particularly show off or anything. They were just trying to train you to be a decent lawyer. And of course, I guess my favorite, because of what I later ended up doing, was Jim Neal. Jim Neal had just finished prosecuting Jimmy Hoffa, and so he was teaching criminal procedure. And Jim Sanders and I were in that class. That's another law student cohort. And Jim would come in and talk mostly about the Hoffa trial, and we ate it up because this was real life stuff.
This was the real thing.
And so he was quite an influence on me.
Was there ever any question you were going to work for Tom Shriver once you graduated from law school?
There was no question I wanted to. Sissy Daughtry, to her credit, when she was an assistant there, and Bill Parker, one of the assistants, had decided to leave and go back to the police department to be legal advisor, she recommended to Tom that he hire me full-time when and if I graduated. I didn't have a great track record on graduations, but...
and if you passed the bar.
And I had to pass the bar. And you want to tell about that?
I'd like to ask you about it.
Yeah. April 14, 1973 was a Saturday, and I had arranged to go on a cave trip. Tom Shriver was a very accomplished cave explorer, and I had learned about this after I'd hired on with him. I did not realize, for example, that he had been one of the companions of Don Ball, a Hillsborough High School student who was killed in the very cave where I was a tour guide, and I had told that story hundreds of times, not realizing that I would later work for one of the people that was involved in it. But he was a real fine caver, and he wanted to go on a cave trip, and it just by coincidence was the same Saturday that the bar results were coming out. And I got to his house to pick him up over on Villa Crest and realized at that moment, wait a minute, what if I don't pass? This is going to be a long day. And his newspaper's lying in the driveway. So, and back then you didn't, that was the only way you found out. You pick up a newspaper. So I went and opened the newspaper, looked in, found my name on the list of people that had passed, tied it back up, took it in, threw it down and said, "Oh, General, I passed the bar exam. See you Monday." It could have been a very different day.
How long did you serve as an assistant district attorney in Tom Shriver's office?
That was about 3.5 years. Started in April '73, and then in summer of '76, I got that call from John Hollins and to lure me away. And so I left there, I guess, in August of '67.
You know, before we get to going to practice with John Hollins, tell us a little bit about what it meant to your career to work in the DA's office for 3.5 years.
Garrett, quite honestly, it was at the same time the most challenging, but the most thrilling thing I guess I've ever done. And I've done a lot of odd things, as we've already revealed, but what a privilege. I mean, one minute I'm this law student kind of, bumbling my way through life, and the next minute I'm a trial prosecutor standing in criminal court making sentencing decisions and trying lawsuits. My first trial was a murder case that was three months after I got my license. Doug Thorson took me into criminal court Division III on a murder case that Bobby Schwartz didn't want to try. It was a 3-defendant penitentiary murder case, and they couldn't find the witness. And so I hung around with all these guys, and they knew that I was a willing assistant, so I got to go in quick. And that Monday morning, the witness was nowhere to be found. And so Doug comes over to me and says, because the Judge Cornelius, had turned down a continuance. We'd had a big hearing on that, and he flatly refused to do it. And so Doug says, stay here, pick a jury, but don't let it get sworn in. Well, what are you going to do? And he's going to the Court of Appeals to stop the trial. And so I'm doing my job. I'm dragging it out. Of course, I got Gary Gober on the other side, so it wasn't too hard. But there was three of them. About 3 in the afternoon, we had about maybe 4 jurors seated, still questioning one at a time. Yeah. And Jimmy Shea, deputy clerk under Earl Hawkins.
I remember Jimmy.
Comes in the back door, hands a piece of paper to Judge Cornelius. And I've told people it was like those old cartoons where he's starting to read it, and the red starts here and goes up and then shoots out the top. It was a writ of certiorari and supersedious, signed by Judge Bill Russell of the Court of Criminal Appeals, stopping the trial, granting the continuance to give us an opportunity to find our witness. And I thought my career was over, because I'm the only DA in the room. And I really think what saved me is that I don't think Alan Cornelius wanted to give somebody like me, 3 months out of law school, credit. So he went off on Thorson and Shriver for about 5 minutes. And I'm just standing there kind of, sort of like being back in combat.
Staying low.
Yeah, I'm taking, in the military, we'd call that a defilade position. I'm hiding behind the books, And so, but there's nothing he can do.
You've mentioned all of the outstanding people that worked in the DA's office, I guess, during that period, or most of them. Any defense lawyers that stood out to you as being people that you want to mention?
You're really good at this, You're the best. You had asked me about that, and I got to thinking about that, and I realized that I didn't want to come over here today and do a, kind of a half-decent job of that. So I did a little homework. And I'll have to be able to read. I went back, and I actually had kept some records of the jury trials that I had when I was in the DA's office.
Yeah.
And I made a list of the lawyers that were on the other side of those jury trials, people that I think, if anybody ever watches this, if any of the older guys ever watch this, they're going to recognize these names if you let me read them.
Sure.
Avon Williams.
Wow.
John Kyle. I tried about 12 cases. John Kyle was the lead public defender in our court at that time. Bill Bruce, Jim Omer, Bob Skinner, Seth Norman, Bob Lillard, Bill Wilson, Craig Morrow, Buddy Collins, Don Arkovitz, Bill Porter, Battle Claiborne, Charlie Hendricks, David Vincent, George Ferris, Dan Garfinkel, Martin Arnold Peebles. Peebs' father, he had to come in and try a case because Arnold had been disbarred as a result of all that mess in the string bean case.
Wow.
Lost my place. Tom Stewart, Bob Polk, Lionel Barrett. By the way, Bob Polk and Lionel Barrett were both combat veterans. Lee Allen, Dale Quillen, Joe Binkley Sr., Jack Thompson, Malcolm McCune, Steve Cox, Gary Gober, and Tom Black.
You realize you've just named the criminal bar that I knew when I was a young lawyer.
Yes.
All of them.
Yes.
Wow.
And frankly, when I looked at that, Gareth, and realized, it just brought back a flood of memories because, those people, some of them were amazing. Ferris and Garfinkel, for example, they would come over, they'd have 50 cases, and they would come over to criminal court, get an indictment on arraignment day, fold it up and put it back in their pocket and take it over to the office. 3 months later, they'd come over with that same thing rolled up, except they'd have all these notes and try a 2-day jury case. And that would be the file. And sometimes they win. That's pretty humiliating. Yeah, even though preparation was not exactly a hallmark back in those days, Garfinkel used to say, when he was talking about somebody, if he wanted to compliment them, and I remember he complimented Randall Wyatt to me one time, he says, he can talk. He can talk.
What happened in the, I guess it was the fall of 1976 to take you away from the DA's office?
Well, I got a call from John Hollins. Now, I had met John Hollins. I need to go back a ways on this just real quick. When I was there in '68, of course, I was up on the 6th floor. That's where the DA's office was at that time. And they had 3 criminal court divisions on that same floor, those big, high courtrooms with the mahogany walls. And I would, every opportunity I'd get, I'd slip down and watch a trial, because to me that was the exciting part. And I guess I have to confess, I've always, for some reason, been attracted to what I would call the action. In other words, if I was a caver, I wanted to go someplace nobody else had ever been. If I was in the Army, I wanted to be in the combat zone. And now in legal work, I wanted to be in the courtroom. It just seemed like that was where the excitement was.
Yeah.
And so I would go down there and watch. And at that time, there was a trial involving 3 defendants, Parker, Canaday, and Allen, who were 3 Black Panthers who had come down to Nashville from, I believe, Cincinnati to demonstrate against the war and against some other things. Of course, that was before King had been assassinated. But they shot and killed 2 Nashville police officers. And John Hollins, who at that time was still the lead man, first assistant for Tom Shriver, was prosecuting that case in Judge Leather's court. And I would slip in the back and watch that. And that was just thrilling to me. I just thought that that was the most exciting thing I'd seen. And then in '76, I get a call from the same John Hollins. And I'm obviously flattered, but I'm not sure what's going on. And he told me that he and John Wagster, my former classmate, who'd been editor of the Law Review, were going to leave their firms, Shulman, McCarley, Hollins, and Pride, and Willis and Knight, and form their own firm, and they were going to share space with Jim Neal and Aubrey Harwell on the 8th floor of Third National Bank Building, and that I want to be the 3rd man. And knowing what I know now, you'd think, absolutely. I turned him down, because I was enjoying what I was doing so much that I didn't think private practice sounded all that exciting. Yeah. Within a day of that, I saw Bob Brandt on the street. And Bob Brandt has always been a friend, and I told him what had happened. And he looked at me like I was from Mars and said, you go back in there and call him. That's great. That's the best opportunity I've ever heard of. You go back and call John Hollins and tell him you'll take that job. And fortunately, I had enough sense to listen to him, and I did. And so I was law partners with John Hollins for 31 years.
You know, you have a uniqueness you may not realize, but there are not many attorneys who can or have been known to try both civil and criminal cases. What was the mix, or what did your career
Well, now that's all Hollins, see, because I'd tried 50 or 60 jury trials those 3 years in the DA's office. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, we'd try them back to back, 2 a week. And so I had gotten accustomed to that early on. But when I went to work for them, of course, I had no cases. And now I'm on the other side. Mm-hmm. But they had Allstate Insurance Company and State Farm as clients. And they were doing homeowners liability cases and automobile cases for those 2 insurance companies. So they fed me a steady stream of what I would call routine civil tort cases and send me over there to try them. So within a year or 2, I had 10 or 15 civil jury trials under my belt, having, only tried criminal cases before that.
What, as your career progressed, Ed, at that firm, is there any percentage of criminal cases and civil cases?
I've really never worked that out. I've got some records now that might enable me to do that, but I'm guessing it's about 70-30. 70% criminal and 30% civil.
Right.
But some of those civil cases are quite demanding. I tried several medical malpractice cases on the plaintiff side. I defended some arson cases for Allstate.
Yeah.
And as you know, insurance companies not always that popular as a named defendant in the courtroom. So those are tough. Now Wagster used to excel at that. He would represent State Farm on those cases and win most of them.
Right. Right.
But it was good training. Early on, John Hollins and I got involved in two really big cases that he already had with him when he started that group. One was the Jeffrey Womack case, the Trimble murder case, and we worked on that for 30 years before he was exonerated by the arrest and conviction of Jerome Barrett. But the other one was, which heated up much quicker, was a fellow named Eddie Shaw, who was Ray Blanton's best friend and one of his close political advisors. And he was transportation commissioner and a member of the governor's cabinet under the administration of Ray Blanton in 75 to 79. And Jim Neal, right down the hall, had represented a fellow named Sonny McCarter, who was the one that spilled the beans when the TBI came calling about what they were doing with the surplus vehicles. They were basically selling them to their friends. And the DAs in Chattanooga and Nashville considered that to be a fraud. So they indicted Eddie, and in Chattanooga they indicted 4 other people. And Hollins had that case. So within a year of coming out of the DA's office, I'm in the paper every day with John defending Eddie Shaw. Because by then the press hated Ray Blanton. They thought he was crooked. He'd already done something for the guy Humphreys, the fellow that was in penitentiary for murder and ended up as a photographer for the corrections department. And he was later pardoned or commuted. So it was unbelievable, and so we defended that case. And
how did that case come out?
I'm glad you asked. He was acquitted of all 52 counts.
So you tried it?
We tried it together, and Judge Draper, we were in Judge Draper's court right across from Judge Leathers, where I'd been prosecuting, and he let both of us argue. And John always liked to do the opening, so he let me do the closing. And
really?
Yeah. So that was we were pretty good in court. I think we had 8 major jury trials in criminal cases and lost 1.
I don't want to go too long on this, but I'm also fascinated with a 30-year case where your client was finally exonerated.
Yes.
Tell us what you consider the highlights of Womack. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it's important.
Again, a plug for the NBA website. Go to YouTube, type in Nashville Bar Association, and there's 3 hours of video on the Trimble case. But yes, that case was one of a kind. Now, I had been in the DA's office when the murder happened in '75, but I had no connection with it. And then in 1979, when I had been with John for almost 3 years, the police in the middle of the night went out on West End and arrested him. I think they were under the impression they could badger him in the car on the way downtown to the point where he would confess. But number one, they underestimated him because he was a pretty shrewd young fellow, even though he'd made a lot of mistakes. And number two, he wasn't guilty. He was factually not involved in her death in any way, shape, or form.
But there were people who, till the last year, when you got DNA evidence that it wasn't him, it was someone else, they thought that he had done it.
Absolutely. Police detectives, FBI agents, the citizens at large, there are still people today probably walking around in this town who would say that Jeffrey Womack must have had something to do with it, which shows how adverse publicity can affect the mind of the public. You know, so this business about change of venue and juror bias and so on, that's a real thing. We can testify to that.
And am I correct that it also speaks strongly to what they learned during those 30 years about being able to analyze DNA and the pool that law enforcement put together on DNA?
And if we have time, I can tell you very quickly how that happened in that case, and it is fascinating to me what had to happen in order for them to solve that case.
Be brief.
All right, and credit Tom Thurman on this. Tom Thurman, a fine lawyer, prosecutor all his life, but he tried that case, and he's the one that explained this to me. There was another case, terrible case, a Vanderbilt student who was raped and murdered in her apartment. And it happened a few weeks before the Trimble kidnapping. That case got dropped, basically, by the police because of the Trimble case. A little bit of work was done. Diane Vaughn, read Doug Jones's book called A Season of Darkness. He lays it out for you. But they didn't work on that case. And fast forward 30 years, Sarah Dupre's sister calls the cold case unit of the police department and says, "Whatever happened to my sister's case?" And Pat Bastiglione and Bill Pridemore had never heard of it. And they said, "Well, we don't know, but we'll find out." And they find a file, and there's hardly anything in it. And they go over to the property room, and the evidence is nowhere to be found, but they find it by staying and looking where it should not have been, in the back. And in the back there's this box with Sarah Dupre's clothes and sheets from her bed where she was killed. Never been tested. They sent that to the crime lab, the FBI, at that time FBI, now TBI can do it. And they said, we tested this and we found semen, and we've got DNA, and we've got no matches on the database. But we do have a match to one of your other cases, Marcia Trimble.
Wow.
So at that moment, they knew that if they solved the Dupre case, they also solved the Trimble case. And the problem was that Jerome Barrett, within a few weeks of the death of Marcia Trimble, had been rearrested, put back in prison on parole violation, and when he left, instead of staying in Nashville this time, he went back to Memphis, and they never collected his DNA. So they did some more work, and they realized that he had been a suspect in that case, so they went down to Memphis and got his DNA under a court order. Matched him up.
What a story, man. Fast forwarding here, you received a telephone call after about 30 years with John Hollins and John Wagster that I think changed your career substantially. What was? Tell us about that.
I think, Gareth, that the background on that is probably some of my buddies that I've already mentioned, you know, people like Hal Arden and Randall Wyatt. There was a problem going on at the U.S. Attorney's Office over here in the federal courthouse where the current U.S. Attorney at that time had decided to resign. And the office was having some difficulty because of some political issues over there. And so the Justice Department had sent down a special temporary U.S. attorney, and they were looking for somebody to finish out the Bush term, which at that point was about 2 years. And so I got a call from a staff member in the Senate office of Lamar Alexander. I had known Senator Alexander from the time he was a governor. And they said that somebody had mentioned my name to possibly fill that term. And I was 63 at the time. And of course I was flattered. And then but I said,
who wouldn't be? Yeah.
I said, you know, I'm not sure about that, so I had to think and pray about that a little bit, and go home and explain to my wife the difference in pay and a few other things. And but the more I thought about it, the more I said, you know, if I'm ever going to do anything like that, now's the time. And so I called him back and said, let's go for it. Now, I was more, I guess, thought of as a Democrat than a Republican, but I had become more and more conservative, and I had voted for President Bush and so on. So my conscience was clear on that. But Lamar Alexander got that done because Governor Sundquist's former legal counsel was trying to get it too.
Yeah.
And he obviously had all kinds of political support that I didn't have. And the only thing I can claim in terms of politics on that is once I got the nomination, which occurred during the summer recess in '07, I actually got confirmed about as fast as you can get confirmed because Jim Neal wrote a letter to Patrick Leahy, who was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and John Siegenthaler called Teddy Kennedy.
Now, you had good support.
And they put me on a list, and I went through the Senate like greased lightning.
Did the administrative responsibility of that job worry you going in?
Actually, it's not as hard as you might think because they have such great staff over there. They had the administrative officer, first assistant, and all of that support staff are mostly career people. And because of that, you know, these political appointees come through, but they know how to manage things. And so with their help, I would say it was not as challenging as you might think. And I tried to get in the courtroom. I think I ended up doing about 3 cases. I actually picked a jury in one case that they settled at the lunch break and did a hearing in a bank robbery case and was planning to try a cocaine case with an airplane involved, but I had to leave before it was ready to go.
Any cases, Ed, that happened during your, what, about 3.5 years as United States
Over there?
District Attorney? Yes.
Well, you know, it's funny that most prosecutors will tell you that the cases that mean the most to them are not the ones that get in the paper.
Yeah.
Usually where you have victims that you're particularly empathetic toward. One of the ones that did get in the paper that I felt somehow a little satisfied, although it was not a happy situation, we prosecuted the person who provided the gun that killed Steve McNair. And it turned out that pistol had been either given or sold to the murderer who also killed herself just a few days before. And that was a clear violation of federal firearms statutes. And so we felt to have a deterrent effect on crimes of that sort that we needed to prosecute that case, and we did. And it hit the news all over the country, of course, because of the fame of Steve McNair.
Exactly. Eventually, I'm guessing the time came for somebody else to be appointed.
Yes. I actually held over a 1.5 years under Obama. Again, having friends like Jim Cooper, our congressman, they slow walked my replacement, and I was grateful for that. And then Jerry Martin decided he wanted it, and that was proper, and so he came in May of 2010.
Where did you go?
Well, I went to practice law with a very good friend and a very fine lawyer named Bob Walker. Bob Walker had been a trial lawyer at Bass, Berry & Sims for many years, well known all across the region. And sometime, I guess around the turn of the century, 2000, they decided to leave Bass, Berry & Sims. I mean, there was about 5 or 6 of them litigators.
Right.
They left Bass, Berry & Sims and started a firm, which ultimately became known as Walker, Tips, and Malone. And he just called me up one day. I get a lot of telephone calls, I guess. But he called up one day and said, you know, if you ever leave over there, you know, come talk. So I said, boy, you better. And again, I bounced it off of Brant again. And Brant said that one made his eyes light up, I think is the way he put it. So that was always getting good career advice from Brant.
Well, I can attest that those are fine lawyers that were there. The firm sort of dissolved.
It did. Not long after I left them, they were absorbed by Butler Snow, big firm out of Mississippi that's actually in this building. And Bob, again, being a master at this, he made sure that everybody went with them, that they took the whole group, so there wasn't anybody left behind, so to speak.
And I think you joined the Mcallister firm?
Yeah, and that's a little bit of an odd story, but I'll make it quick, I hope. I'd been with Bob for about 3 years and was starting to build up my practice again. I was getting a lot more federal work, which is what happens when you are a U.S. attorney and leave, the natural thing, I guess. So I had I had actually hired a young lawyer who was originally from Murfreesboro named Alex Little, but I didn't get to serve with him because he came in about the time I was leaving. But he'd been over there 3 years and had prosecuted a number of cases successfully. He also had prosecuted with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia, which is like being an assistant DA because they do the local and the federal up there. And so I wanted to bring him in, and for some reason that didn't satisfy everyone at Walker, and I felt bad about that because I kind of led Alex to believe that would be easy to do. And so we talked about it and decided that the thing to do was for us to go off and join the Bone firm. Mm-hmm. And they have a kind of a meritocracy over there where you kind of eat what you kill.
Right.
And that appealed to me because that's the system I was used to under Hollins. And I hope the general public doesn't hear me say that, but anyway.
No, many firms do operate that way.
Yeah, and that appealed to us, and so we went over there, and that's been 5 years now, and it's been excellent in every aspect. I've been really fortunate, Gary. I want to say this: I've been so blessed to have senior partners that were just the finest people and the finest lawyers that you could ever hope for. I had Tom Shriver originally, and then I had John Hollins for 30 years, Bob Walker, and now Charles Bone. Yeah. And there aren't 4 finer men on the planet.
And it makes all the difference in practice.
It absolutely does.
It lets you do what you're good at and what you're
It absolutely does. And it is a tremendous privilege to have a law license and be able to do what we do. And I don't want to ever take that for granted. I think that's something that every lawyer needs to think about and realize that it's a privilege that carries with it a huge responsibility.
You know, we've covered all this wonderful career that you've had. Tell us about your wife, how you met, and your children.
Well, the meeting my wife relates to my years as a state prosecutor. I had a case in Judge Leather's court, and by the way, Judge Leathers is another great mentor I should thank. I think he's the one that put my name in John Hollins' ear. But I was prosecuting a robbery case at a liquor store on West End Avenue, and an officer named Johnny Lucas, who at that time was a canine officer, meaning he had a dog in the car with him, was the first responder to that. And the robber coming out of the store shot Johnny in the leg. So we had a robbery charge and an assault charge, and I just didn't want to plea bargain it. I just felt like it was too serious. And so we tried that to a jury. And the jury gave the defendant life for the robbery and 5 years for the assault. And Judge Leathers, this is the only time he ever did this, after the jury left the room, he pronounced the judgment that the life sentence would run consecutive to the 5 years. And he called me up to the bench after it was all over and said, "Now, General," he called me General, "General, I ran the life consecutive to the 5 years, because if we ran the 5 years consecutive to the life, he'd never serve that 5 years." And I always thought that was amusing. But anyway, Johnny became a friend, the police officer, and because he was obviously happy with that verdict. And I met his wife, Chi-Chi, who came to know was the lead hairdresser in her part of town. And Chi-Chi just couldn't stand the fact that I was single. And so she would, from time to time, set me up with really some of the primo ladies that would come into that hairdressing salon on a blind date. And one of those blind dates was Cindy.
And that was the end of the dates.
Cindy and I will have been married 32 years in September, and we have 3 children. And yeah, that was a good circumstance in my life, a great blessing.
Well, tell us a little bit about your 3 children.
All right, Charles is the oldest. And as I said, he's over there right now working in the DA's office on a summer intern job. And they're letting him, he's going to be sitting in on a trial in 2 weeks, and he's already handled the jail docket once. And so
wonderful.
He's sort of experiencing what I did in '72. Son Robert graduated from Sanford's, married to Erica, and they live in Franklin. Daughter Allison was married 2 years ago at Belmont University, where she graduated and met her husband, and they both work at Belmont. So we got them all in the area, and everybody's doing well.
Do you have any grandchildren yet?
I have one little grandchild. Her name is Iris Evelyn. She's 9 months. And the second one on the way. That's Charles and Amanda's daughter. And so I'm having to realize that I'm old enough to have grandchildren.
I know it's been important in your life. Where do you attend church, Ed?
I'm sorry?
Church, where do you attend?
It is important. In 1982, I had been attending Woodmont Baptist Church for about 2 years. I was raised in the Methodist Church. My grandfather, one of the founders of the Calvary Methodist Church on Hillsborough Road, and I had been raised there in the Sunday school and so on. But like a lot of people, I guess, when I got to college, I drifted away a little bit. I feel like I had a relationship with the Lord, but I was a little backslidden, if that's the language that the Baptists use. So I started going to Woodmont 1980, and really enjoyed and appreciated Bill Sherman, the pastor there. And so in 1982, I got a visit from one of the other ministers there, and a fellow named Ed Fulcher, who was a local real estate developer. And they sort of confronted me on my relationship with the Lord, and I said, I thought it was good, and they said, well, if you die tonight, what's going to happen? And I said, I think, not a good way to answer that question. I went on a cave trip the following weekend down to Alabama, a really difficult cave, a multi-drop cave, had about 6 or 7 vertical drops, most of them with waterfalls going down them. I was down in that cave, and for some reason that visit came into my head, and I was rigging a carabiner on a bolt, getting ready to go down about an 80-foot pit with water flowing in it. And it just occurred to me, I said, you know, that's something that could happen to me at any minute, any moment, because of what I do. And I'd had close calls in caves. I'd been hit by rocks and missed by rocks. And, of course, in the military, in the Vietnam, I'd had close calls practically every week. And it just hit me that I needed to do something about that issue. And that night I couldn't sleep, so I just apologized to my friend Buddy Lane from Chattanooga, and I said, I got to go back. And I went back home at 3 in the morning, took a shower, went to the church that morning, and walked up and told Bill Sherman that I wanted to be baptized.
There you go.
And frankly, my life's never been the same.
Yeah. I think you're now at Forest Hills.
Yes, there was a major migration, so to speak, of members from Woodmont to Forest Hills in 1993, and we were part of that. And so I've been there now for 25 years.
And I believe that you served as a deacon at your church.
Been a
and an
deacon
elder too.
both there, Woodmont and Forest Hills, for 30 years, and an elder for a while. And I've taught Sunday school for 30 years. Once I got into church membership and realized what it meant, I just felt like I needed to be as involved as I could possibly be. And frankly, I found it to be a tremendous help with my law practice. Because there's so many spiritual aspects of law practice that a lot of people don't appreciate. But once you see that, I mean, the lawyer is very much akin to the Good Samaritan. You know, the story of the Good Samaritan was told by Jesus because a lawyer asked him, who is my neighbor? Okay? So the Good Samaritan is a definition of who your neighbor is. And who is your neighbor? It's anyone you come in contact with who has a need.
And that's what lawyers do.
And you're in a position to fill it, and that's what we do every day. So it had a profound influence, and I'll have to say, I really don't understand how anybody can do it and not have some appreciation for that.
How did you get involved with Belmont University? I know that you've served on their board of trustees.
I was on the board of trustees for 6 years back in the 90s, and that was really just the result of having contributed and knowing people over there. And they, of course, Belmont is one of Nashville's great success stories. Bob Fisher deserves a lot of credit for that. But I got involved as a result of friends there and contributing there. And then now, my daughter graduated from there, got married there, met her husband there. My son is going to, Lord willing, graduate from law school next year there. And so it's just been a wonderful relationship.
I also should mention, and I guess ask you a little bit about the Nashville Bar Association, because you've been such a big part of that. And to some extent, that's unusual for someone who has a lot of criminal practice. Why, you've served as president, you've served on the board twice.
Yeah.
Why your work in the NBA? Why is that important?
Now part of that is probably attributable to John Hollins, because John Hollins had been president of the bar in ~74, just 2 years before I joined him. And so I guess, probably subliminally, I wanted to be like John Hollins a little bit. But the other truth about that is that I always felt like, if you're a lawyer, you got to join the bar. You got to be, a complete lawyer. And not being a member of the bar just didn't seem like that would be an option. And what I discovered when I did it, and really John McLemore is the one that persuaded me on that and got me involved in the newsletter. But once I did it, I realized that it's a tremendous advantage to your practice, because you're dealing with the people in the legal community who will refer you cases, who will be on the other side of cases, and that you'll try, and that you'll have a collegial relationship with them, so that no single case, hopefully, will ever interfere with your relationship with any of these other lawyers. And I think Nashville, more than any other place I've been, still has a lot of that. Now, I think the size is beginning to hurt us a little bit because we don't know each other as well as we used to, and people don't go to the courthouse as often as they used to, which is where a lot of the, mixing and talking would occur. But I just can't imagine being a lawyer and not being active in the Bar Association. There's just so many advantages to it, and I can't think of any disadvantages.
Well, you have been an excellent participant and lawyer. You have, I think, run a number of programs that the Bar Association has had over the last 5 years about history and great cases.
And I really just fell into that, Garrett. Again, Macklemore came to the meeting, the historical committee, and said that we're about to come up on the 50th anniversary of the Baker versus Carr decision. And I didn't have a clue about that. I mean, I knew what it was, but I didn't know it was 50 years. And he gave me a disc from the Chancery Court where they had done a celebration on it, and I tried to give it to a reporter and get him interested in it, and he didn't even look at it.
Well, that series of programs that you have headed up have been some of the best things that the Bar Association has done, and they've been popular.
And the triggering event was the video interview of John J. Hooker.
Yeah.
A lot of people didn't want me to even do that because John J. wasn't that popular back in 2012, if you recall. But I know we're about to run out of time, but he really inspired me to get involved in that, and we're still going. We're going to do another one this year.
What's the biggest challenge from years of practice, Ed, and trial work and in the bar? What are the big challenges to the practice of law for the future?
Wow, that's a mighty big question. I think the hardest thing is to overcome the modern desire for money. I think back when I started and when you started, we were more interested in the process of representing the client, doing a good job. We had egos, sure. We liked to win. But I think that the driving force was to represent the client well, get a good result, and be a good lawyer. And I'm afraid that in many precincts now, the money is the driving force, and that it's not a healthy thing. It leads to ethical problems. We have 20 times more ethical complaints now with the board than we used to have. And I think that the money, as the Bible says, love of money is the root of much evil. And if we love the money too much, we're going to stray from the straight and narrow. So that'd be my quick answer.
Last question. What's your future looking like? Are you still practicing hard and going to go on forever?
I am. When I went to Bone with Alex, we had 8 jury trials in 3 years, and just had a bang-up time. And Hollins and I used to joke about this. Of course, John's no longer with us, but we used to say that we wanted to die somewhere between our desk and the filing cabinet.
Is there anything that's major, Ed, that you wanted to recall or mention in talking about a long and fine career? Or have we touched most of the things?
I've got a story about jury selection, but I don't know if you got time for it. In 1983, when I was president of the bar, I got a chance to visit with Jack Norman Sr. at the Tennessee Bar Convention out at the airport hotel out there. I think he was a speaker on a panel or something. And I'd always wanted to talk to Mr. Norman, who I consider to be, Mr. Hooker and Mr. Norman. They were the kings, right? And I wanted to talk to him about jury selection. And he said, Ed, it's not really that hard. I just eliminate the obvious ones and then try to make friends with the rest of them. And I said, oh, yeah, that sounds good. And then not long after that, my partner, John Norris, who's a very fine civil trial lawyer, I think he's retired now, went to a seminar and came back with all this stuff, you know how they are at seminars, this and that. Yeah. And one of the things they had taught him at the seminar was to memorize the names of the jurors. And most people think that's impossible. You're sitting there, you got a list, you're looking at them, and you're under pressure and everything, and you got to memorize, 20 names. And that's what I thought when I heard him say it. Not long after that, I'm at the church, the old church, Woodmont, and a young woman comes up to me. Her name is Renee Hooper, and she had been on a jury, and she wanted to talk to me about John Norris, who was the finest lawyer she had ever seen, and just was amazing, and just went on and on about John Norris. And I said, well, yeah, he's really good. And I was thinking to myself, he's not that good, you know. Bless his heart, he is good. And come to find out, the thing that impressed her was that he knew her name and didn't have to look at a list. And I said, whoa, maybe that's not such a gimmick after all. Maybe that's part of Mr. Norman's advice, make friends with the rest of them. So this is over 30 years ago. I started doing that. I found out I could do that with relative ease. The most I've ever done, I think, is 35. Most of the time, you're dealing with 18, something like. You're never dealing with just 12. You know, you got the box,
right.
the 2 alternates, and usually 3 or 4 over here. But I'm here to tell you, I think I have won 30 or 40 jury trials, in part, maybe in whole, because I was able to look at those people and say their name and sometimes even what they did for a living without looking at anything. And when you're defending, particularly, if you can get the jury thinking about something other than the state's evidence, you're halfway home.
Ed, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your career and your life.
Thank you. I'm ashamed that I ended with a brag, but that's just been an incredible revelation to me how that
Well, it's a
operates.
good lawyer. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did we get it?
We got